Hey there, deep diver. Have you ever heard of a city like trying to tax the national government?
I mean, it sounds kind of crazy.
Right. It's
Yeah,
like, can the government actually make money off of its own money?
yeah.
It's a question that sparked a whole lot of buzz around a Supreme Court case here in the Philippines.
Yeah, this case really dives into some complex issues about government assets and local taxation.
Okay, so let's unpack this whole thing. We're talking about City of Davao and Mr. Erwin Alparaque versus AP Holdings Incorporated. GR number 245887, decided January 22nd, 2020.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds pretty official, right?
It is.
But so where do coconuts fit into all of this? This is where it gets interesting.
Well, this whole thing goes back to the 80s
Okay.
when the government was, trying to find ways to support coconut farmers.
Right.
And so they created this special fund.
Right.
It's called the Coconut Industry Investment Fund, or CIIF.
CIIF.
Yeah, and they use taxes from coconut products to basically invest back into the industry.
So they were basically taking a more investment-driven approach as opposed to like direct subsidies or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And one of their big moves was buying shares in San Miguel Corporation.
Yeah, SMC.
Yeah, big player in the Philippine economy. And to manage those shares, they set up these holding companies. One of them was AP Holdings Inc., or APHI.
Okay.
So APHI's job was essentially to hold those shares and manage the dividends that came from them.
Gotcha. So APHI is like the caretaker of those shares,
Yes.
right? Making sure they're managed properly.
Exactly. And dividends, those are basically those profit shares that companies give out to their stockholders.
Okay, I'm starting to see where this is going. So then the city of Davao enters the picture, and they see these dividends coming in and think, hey, we could use a piece of that.
Right, and that's where a conflict comes in.
Okay.
In 2011, the city of Davao actually claimed that APHI owed them local business taxes on those SMC dividends.
Now, that seems a little odd to me. Like, isn't the CIF and everything it owns ultimately owned by the national government?
Right.
So how can a city tax the national government?
Yeah, that was APHI's argument.
Yeah.
They were like, hey, wait a minute. Under Philippine law, local governments don't have the authority to tax the national government.
It'd be like taking money out of one pocket and putting it in another
Exactly right, yeah.
in the same pair of pants.
Exactly.
So did the courts agree with APHI right away?
Well, not really.
Okay.
This case went through the whole Philippine legal system.
Wow.
Started at the regional trial court, then went up to the Court of Tax Appeals, and then finally landed in the Supreme Court.
Up to the big leagues, huh?
Yeah. And actually, the lower courts, they initially agreed with the city of Davao. They said APHI was liable for those local business taxes on those dividends.
Interesting.
Yeah,
But then the Supreme Court steps in and things take a kind of different turn.
exactly. The Supreme Court decided to take a closer look at APHI's role and their purpose. And this is where we get to this phrase, non-bank financial intermediary.
Okay, non-bank financial intermediary. All right, so break that down for me. What does that even mean, and why does it matter in this case?
Okay, so think of it like this. A non-bank financial intermediary is basically an institution that handles financial activities, but they're not a traditional bank, like investment firms or lending companies.
Okay, gotcha.
So the city of Davao, they were trying to say that APHI was basically acting like one of these intermediaries
Okay.
because Philippine law allows local governments to tax dividends received by banks and financial institutions. So Davao was trying to kind of fit APHI into that category to justify their tax claim.
So they were trying to be a little sneaky.
Clever, but it didn't work. The Supreme Court, they dug into APHI's founding documents, like their amended Articles of Incorporation, and those documents, they clearly stated that APHI's primary role was to hold and manage the shares, not to actively trade them or invest them for profit.
So the court was basically making a distinction between just holding assets and actually doing more complex financial stuff, right?
Yeah. Right, exactly. And they pointed out that APHI was actually prohibited from acting like an investment company or a securities broker.
Okay.
So that was a key point in saying that APHI was not a non-bank financial intermediary.
The Supreme Court was saying, hey, APHI is just doing what it was told to do.
Mm-hmm.
They're not playing the stock market or anything.
Exactly.
So the court recognized that even though APHI was putting those dividends in a trust account,
Right.
they weren't doing anything wrong. They were just fulfilling their duty as a CIF holding company.
Right. And that comes down to the intent behind it.
Right.
APHI, they weren't making independent financial decisions to generate profit. They were following the mandate of the CIF, which ultimately serves the Republic of the Philippines.
So the Supreme Court actually referenced a previous case,
They did.
City of Davao versus Randy Allied Ventures Incorporated. And in that case, they made a similar ruling about another CIF holding company.
So Are we starting to see a pattern here? Like, is the Supreme Court saying, hey, local governments, you can't tax the national government, even indirectly? Yeah, you're picking up on it. That distinction between local and national government authority is a big deal in Philippine law. This case really highlighted how important it is to keep those boundaries clear.
Okay, so this is where things get really interesting for me.
Hmm.
What does this mean for coconut farmers, the folks that the CIIF was designed to help in the first place?
Yeah, that's a big question.
Does this decision help them, hurt them in the long run?
Well, it's kind of a double-edged sword, There are arguments on both sides.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break it down for me. What are the potential benefits for the coconut farmers?
Well, the Supreme Court's decision basically acts like a shield, protecting those CII funds from being chipped away by local taxes.
Okay.
And that can mean more resources available for programs that directly benefit coconut farmers and the whole industry.
Okay, that makes sense. So protecting those funds at the national level could have a bigger impact down the line.
Exactly. It kind of safeguards that initial mission of the CIIF to help the coconut industry nationwide.
But you said double-edged sword. So what are the potential downsides?
Right. Well, imagine you're a local government in a coconut producing region, right? You see all those dividends flowing into APHI and you think, man, we could use that money right here to improve our local infrastructure, build better roads for transporting coconuts, or fund some agricultural training programs.
Okay, so from the local government's perspective, they're probably seeing this ruling and thinking, man, that was a missed opportunity.
Right. And some people might argue that this decision actually prevents local governments from being as responsive to the specific needs of their farmers.
So it becomes kind of like a debate about centralized versus decentralized power. Who gets to decide how to use the resources?
Exactly. And this case really shines a light on just how tricky those dynamics can be, especially when you're trying to balance those national interests with what individual communities need.
It's wild how a case that starts with something as simple as coconuts can lead to all these bigger questions about how our country is governed and how we manage our finances and resources.
Right. It's like a chain reaction.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It shows how much is at stake in these legal decisions and how they can have far-reaching consequences. And that's why we love doing these deep dives. We get to uncover all those layers beneath the surface.
Exactly.
And for our listeners out there who might be wondering, what does all of this mean for other government-owned corporations in the Philippines? Well, we're going to explore those questions right after this break.
Stay tuned.
So before the break, we were talking about how the Supreme Court basically said, hey, APHI, you're off the hook.
Right. They recognized that APHI was basically just an extension of the national government, just managing those CIF assets for the good of the whole country.
Right. But I'm still curious, what does all this mean for coconut farmers? The people the CIIF was supposed to be helping.
Yeah, that's a great question. Does this decision help them or hurt them? It's tough to say.
It's like a million peso question, right?
Yeah, it really is. It's a double-edged sword. There are valid points on both sides.
Okay, I'm all ears, lay it on me. What are the potential benefits for the coconut farmers?
Okay, so think of it this way. The Supreme Court's decision is like a shield protecting those CIIF funds from being whittled away by local taxes.
Okay.
So theoretically, that could mean more money is available for programs and initiatives that directly support the farmers and the whole industry.
That makes sense. So protecting the money at the national level could lead to more effective investments in the long run.
Exactly. It really reinforces the CIIF's original mission to strengthen the coconut industry on a national scale.
Okay, so that's one side of the coin. But you mentioned a double-edged sword, right? What are the potential downsides for the farmers?
Well, flip the script for a second. Imagine you're a local government in like a coconut producing province.
Okay.
You see all those dividends flowing into APHI and you think, hey, we could really use some of that money right here in our community.
Yeah, I can see that.
To improve infrastructure, build better roads, to transport the coconuts, fund some agricultural training programs.
Yeah, so for the local governments, this ruling might feel like a bit of a loss.
Right.
Like a missed opportunity to directly invest in their communities.
Exactly. And some folks might say that this limits the ability of local governments to respond to the specific needs of their farmers.
So it boils down to that age-old debate, centralized power versus decentralized power. Who gets to decide how the money is spent?
Exactly. And this case really highlights how complicated those dynamics can be, especially when we're trying to find that balance between national interests and the needs of specific communities.
It's amazing how a case that starts with something as seemingly simple as coconuts can bring up these huge questions about how our government works how we handle finances and resources.
It's true.
It's like a case study in Philippine governance and economics all rolled into one.
Yeah, it really exposes those connections between different parts of our system.
And for our listeners out there who are probably thinking, okay, what does all this mean for the future? What are the wider implications of this case for other government-owned corporations in the Philippines?
Well, this ruling could definitely influence how other government assets are managed.
Okay.
And it raises questions about whether we might see similar tax disputes pop up in the future.
Right. So this case is kind of like a wake-up call.
Mm-hmm.
It's making everyone take a closer look at how these government-holding companies operate and how they fit into the whole tax system.
Exactly. And it's sparking a debate about whether we need to make any changes to the way local governments collect taxes.
Right. Because on one hand, we want local governments to have the resources they need to serve their communities.
Right.
But we also have to respect the authority of the national government.
It's a tough balance to strike.
It is. It's a conversation we need to have as a country. This case has opened up a whole can of worms about government finances, local autonomy, and how we make sure resources are distributed fairly.
It really has. And those are conversations we can't afford to ignore.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Before we wrap up, let's take a minute to recap some of the key takeaways from this case. Okay, so we're back, and we've been really digging into this whole Supreme Court case. City of Davao and Mr. Erwin Alparaque versus APHI Holdings, Inc., GR number 245887, decided on January 22nd, 2020. It's about government assets and local taxes and, that whole push and pull between national and local interests here in the Philippines.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. Right? We started with coconuts and ended up exploring this whole web of laws and regulations that kind of control how our country's finances work.
It's a wild ride. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to take a step back and think about the bigger picture here.
Yeah.
What are the long-term implications of this decision? Like, what does it all mean?
Well, it definitely sets a precedent.
Okay.
It's a pretty clear message to local governments all over the Philippines that certain assets, particularly those that are meant to benefit the whole nation, are under the authority of the national government.
So no dipping their toes into the national cookie jar, even if it's filled with coconut dividends.
Exactly. And this could have a domino effect on how local governments approach bringing in money in the future. They might have to get a little more creative in finding ways to raise funds, especially if they have a lot of government-owned corporations operating within their borders.
So it's a bit of a wake-up call. Like,
Yeah.
hey, local governments, you got to step up your financial game.
Yeah, kinda. But beyond the money, what about the legal and political side of things?
Right, what about that?
Well, this case has definitely stirred up some debate about local autonomy versus national authority. It's a question that's always been there in Philippine governance, and this case has brought it front and center.
It's like you pull on one thread and the whole sweater starts to unravel.
Mm-hmm.
Suddenly we're seeing how connected all these different levels of government are and how one court decision can have a ripple effect across the whole system.
Exactly. It really highlights how important it is to have clear laws and boundaries when it comes to managing government assets and figuring out how to allocate resources.
So for our listeners out there, every day Filipinos trying to make sense of all this legal stuff, what's the takeaway? What does this mean for them?
Well, this case is a reminder that even legal decisions that seem like they only affect a certain industry or situation can have consequences that reach far and wide.
Right.
It encourages us to pay attention to these legal battles and really think about how they might impact our communities.
It's a call to action, right? Stay informed, be critical thinkers, and participate in shaping the future of our country.
Absolutely. And it reinforces this idea that the law, with all its complexities, it's not just some abstract thing. It has real-world impacts on the lives of everyday Filipinos, whether you're a coconut farmer, a city official, or just a regular citizen trying to understand the rules.
So, Deep Diver, as we wrap up this exploration, what are your thoughts? Did any of this surprise you? Did it make you rethink how the national and local governments interact?
We'd love to hear your perspectives. Leave us a comment down below and let us know what parts of this deep dive resonated with you.
And if you enjoyed this journey into Philippine law and finance and the surprising world of coconuts, don't forget to like and subscribe to The Deep Dive for more explorations of these kind of captivating topics.
Thanks for joining us.